Boring history for sleep? Why Georgian England feared cabbage theft? Hey guys. Tonight we're heading way back to the muddy lanes and creaking signposts of Georgian England, where the gaslights flicker. Chimneys belch soft smoke, and something sinister is afoot in the cabbage patches. Picture a gentle night fog drifting through a quiet village, the hoot of an owl somewhere in the hedgerow, and the soft rustle of leaves disturbed not by wind but by fingers. Fingers that don't belong there. That's right, we're talking about cabbage theft. A crime so petty it sounds made up, and yet brace yourself, it could land you in stocks, ruin your reputation, or worse. And no, you probably wouldn't survive this economy. Because if you think groceries are pricey now, wait till you see the stakes when one cabbage means the difference between dinner and disgrace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is where you are. Always love seeing the sleepy corners of the world drift in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly down a country path, the edges lined with low stone walls. It's late, somewhere around 1793, and the moonlight glints off dew-soaked leaves. There's a cottage on your right, with smoke still puffing gently from its chimney, though the windows are dark. Nestled beside it, just barely fenced, is a garden. And in that garden, cabbages, round, heavy, and gleaming like nature's green cannonballs. You step closer and realize, this isn't just food, it's currency, it's status, it's survival. In Georgian England, cabbage wasn't just something to boil into submission, it was proof that you had land. Time and enough security to plant, tend, and guard your vegetables. Owning a garden, even a tiny kitchen plot, was a mark of modest prosperity. And vegetables, especially hardy ones like cabbages, were the backbone of the working family's diet. They filled you up. They stored well. They could even be sold at market if you had enough. That's why they were worth stealing. You imagine yourself crouching behind the hedge, the soft crack of twigs underfoot, watching someone slip through a gate. Just a boy, maybe 13, nimble and barefoot. He glances around, then dashes to the patch. One cabbage in his arms and he's off again into the dark. A small crime, but tomorrow morning the owner will see the gap in his tidy row and feel something deeper than annoyance. Violation, panic. Because in a time with no refrigeration, no supermarkets, and wages that barely bought bread, losing a cabbage was like losing your pantry's foundation brick. Georgian England wasn't known for its generous food system. If you were poor, you grew what you ate. If someone stole that well, you were going hungry. Or worse, you had to ask for parish relief, and few things stung more than that public humiliation. It's easy now to laugh at the idea of leafy vegetables being guarded like heirlooms. But imagine it's February. The nights are cold, potatoes are dwindling, meat's a Sunday luxury. And 1 week, a row of winter cabbages is your only buffer from boiling gruel over and over. That green globe suddenly feels priceless. Mainstream history remembers the grand wars, the powdered wigs, and the revolutions. But not the slow, quiet war between neighbors in nightfall. Not the old man who plants his spring greens with military precision, only to find a few gone come morning. And definitely not the family who quietly trades a stolen cabbage for a chunk of bread, and prays no one asks too many questions. Now, there's a quirky detail you'll love. Some gardeners would literally bury bells under their cabbages. That's right, teeny, twine-attached warning systems that jingled if someone yanked up the plant too hastily. Home Alone, Georgian style. No marbles on the floor, just cabbages rigged like medieval landmines. Even better? Some claim more eccentric. Gardeners would dye the outer leaves with a bitter powder to discourage nibblers both animal and human, because nothing ruins your cabbage stealth mission quite like a mouthful of sulfur. Historians still argue whether cabbage theft was truly as rampant as the court records suggest, or if it became a sort of moral scapegoat, a tangible, visible offense that local authorities could prosecute. When bigger social issues went conveniently ignored, but regardless of scale, the fear was real. Garden walls went up, keys turned, and the cabbage became not just dinner, but battleground. And it's not just the poor who suffered when a cabbage vanished. Imagine you're a clerk, freshly, upwardly mobile, in your tiny backyard plot, is your pride and joy. You're already mocked for getting your hands dirty, and now someone's made off with your best Savoy. How do you explain that to your neighbors or to your mother-in-law? The theft isn't just physical. It's emotional. It's social. You didn't protect your property. You failed the unwritten rules of the tidy, God-fearing home. A cabbage wasn't just food. It was morality in chlorophyll form. As you walk farther down the lane, you pass another cottage. A woman stands by her door, lantern in hand, scanning the fields. She thinks she hears something. A fox, maybe. Or a boy. Either way, she tightens her shawl and waits, willing the shadows to stay still. You're beginning to feel the slow burn of how deeply vegetables could divide a village. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because while most people stole cabbages for food, others stole them just because they could. Acts of petty rebellion, neighborhood feuds taken out on the nearest greenery, or kids daring each other for bragging rights. Bet you won't snatch old Mr. Priddle's cabbage. It's got a pitchfork. You shake your head, amused and a little chilled, because the stakes, humble as they seem, were real. Lose enough cabbages and you could spiral. Lose your patch entirely, and you might end up on the edge of the workhouse. You glance back at the moonlit garden, where the heavy heads of cabbage sit quietly, glistening with dew, unaware that their very existence might one day cause a scandal. You follow the lane as it narrows, the hedgerows thickening around you, the smell of turned earth lingering in the air. Somewhere close, a cow shifts in its sleep, and from a nearby copse, the soft call of a nightjar reminds you. This is rural England in the 1700s. Quiet, careful, and always watching. Your feet crunch over pebbles and clumps of hardened mud as you pass another cottage garden. This one's grander, a gentleman's country retreat with tidy beds, decorative borders, and an ornamental goose statue keeping watch. But even here, tucked behind polite hedges and painted fences, cabbages still grow. Rows of them, bright, firm, and dignified, and just as theft-prone. What you start to realize is that cabbages aren't just food, they're wealth. No, not the kind you spend on silk waistcoats or fancy wigs. This is slow, damp wealth. The kind that grows underground and carries a smell. But wealth all the same. Imagine this. You earn 6 pence a day, maybe less, if the weather's bad, or the local squire is feeling frugal. A large cabbage, fully matured and ready for sale at the local market, might fetch 3 pence half a day's pay, just like that. And that's not even counting the potatoes, the kale, or the turnips lining the garden edge like little sentries. One cabbage, half a day's labor. Suddenly you feel it, that shift in how you think about vegetables. They're not dinner, they're assets. Now, if you grow a dozen of them, you're looking at the equivalent of several days' wages. Maybe enough to buy coal for the winter, or flour. Or a new pair of boots for your son, who keeps stuffing straw into the holes in his current ones. You pause near a low wall, crouch slightly, and look over. Another cabbage patch, smaller this time, probably belonging to a widow or a tenant farmer. The cabbages aren't quite as impressive. Some are misshapen, with a few outer leaves curling like tired fingers, but they're there, and they're guarded too. It's not by bells this time, but by a ragged scarecrow. One arm drooping, straw peeking from its elbow. Still, it's a message. I see you. Keep walking. There's a curious detail most people today would miss. Some poorer gardeners actually grew their cabbages behind their homes, not for privacy, but for protection. Out front was for flowers if you had them, something to impress passers-by. But out back was the bank vault. That's where the cabbage sat. It's also where cabbage theft often struck. Not all thieves were desperate, though. Some were simply opportunists. Traveling laborers, seasonal workers, vagrants, people who wandered from town to town, staying nowhere long enough to earn trust. Some of them didn't even eat the stolen vegetables themselves. They sold them to others, usually quickly and quietly, before vanishing down the next country lane. That's where things get sticky. See, in a lot of Georgian towns. Selling food at market without being a known localor, without a proper stall license, was suspicious at best. Illegal at worst. That meant if you were caught hawking a suspiciously fresh cabbage and your face wasn't familiar, questions followed. Whose garden had this come from? Were you the grower? Or the grubby-fingered middleman? Historians still debate how structured this black market was. Some suggest small networks existed, traders who quietly moved produce from village to village, dodging the taxman and the town constables. Others believe it was more of a scattershot affair, random thefts, quick trades, and then a dash for cover. Either way, the cabbage had become, let's say, liquid. Not in the soup sense. In the economic sense. Could be moved, bartered, replaced. And yet it left a visible void when gone. A missing cabbage wasn't abstract. It was a literal hole in the garden, in the meal plan, in the ledger of weekly survival. There's a quirky side note here. In some villages, missing cabbages were even mentioned during Sunday sermons. That's right, sermons. Picture your local vicar, robes rustling, voice echoing through a chilly stone church, delivering a thundering reminder about the sanctity of thy neighbor's produce. Imagine trying to focus on your hymnal while the whole room glances sideways at Mr. Glover's son, who just last week got caught sneaking around someone's parsnips. And the social fallout? Oof! Georgian communities were tightened in, and reputations stuck like molasses. If you or a family member were suspected of cabbage pilfering, even without proof, it could mark your household for years. Tradesmen might avoid you. Offers of help from the parish might dry up. You became the butt of jokes, silent ones, often, cruel whispered ones. It's why some families, once accused, would move entirely. Pack up and try again in the next village, which only made those newcomers more suspicious in their new home. A vicious cabbage cycle. Now walk a bit further with me, down a short gravel lane that leads to a larger estate. Here, the garden is massive, geometrically perfect. Even lines of cabbages sit beside carrots and runner beans. The air smells sharper, fresher somehow. The gardener lives on the property, and he's fiercely proud. You see his silhouette even now, standing beside a wheelbarrow, smoking a short clay pipe, making sure the night stays quiet. This isn't just about food. This is prestige. For wealthy landowners, kitchen gardens were a symbol of good management and civilized living. The best estates were expected to be self-sufficient, with carefully rotated crops, neatly weeded beds, and not a single missing cabbage. Theft here, oh no. That wasn't just petty crime. That was a direct insult to the master's sense of order. A cabbage stolen from this garden could cause absolute uproar. You'd be reported, hunted, perhaps dragged before a magistrate, and the gardener himself would be interrogated. Was he negligent? Did he fall asleep? Did he know the thief? The stakes scaled with the social ladder, but oddly, the cabbage remained constant. Whether you were a laborer protecting your one patch of winter greens, or a lord overseeing acres of produce, the cabbage had weight. Literal, figurative, emotional, financial. You turn back toward the village now, breeze nudging your coat, and for a moment you feel it. That's strange. Quiet reverence for the vegetable that somehow anchored a whole society's anxiety. Not bread, not butter, not even beer, just cabbage. You follow the curve of a hedgerow, the path crunching quietly beneath your shoes. And now the countryside opens just a little, revealing fields, not of crops, but of confusion and quiet resentment. This is where the story picks up steam, because the cabbages you've seen, those round, unassuming sentinels of supper, and social order are about to become targets in a much bigger shuffle of power. You've entered the age of enclosure. Now, if you're picturing a couple of farmers politely fencing off their lawns, you might want to tighten your bonnet. The enclosure acts passed in waves between the 17th and 19th centuries radically reshaped the rural world. And yes, that includes the humble cabbage's fate. Fields that were once shared, wandered, grazed, and gardened by all were now divided up with hedges, ditches, and gates. You reach out and touch one of those hedges, thorny, unfriendly, fresh, before enclosure. Much of the English countryside operated under common rights, a system where poorer villagers could graze animals, gather firewood, or grow a few crops on shared land. It wasn't a perfect utopian. It was abundant. Hygiene was optional, but it was balanced. You fed your family with what the land gave, and the land was open. But after enclosure, that land was suddenly owned, controlled, no longer common. And with ownership came boundaries, real ones, written ones, defended ones. And here's the kicker. Those new owners didn't always live on the land. Wealthy investors, absentee landlords, and climbing gentry started fencing and leasing the countryside like it was a board game. Except instead of little red hotels, they were planking down walls and evicting entire communities in the process. This was more than economics. It was a quiet cultural earthquake. Families who'd degrown cabbages on the same sliver of common earth for generations now found themselves locked out, sometimes literally. And so, where does a cabbage thief come from? Often from someone who used to have the right to plant that cabbage. Someone who didn't change their heart overnight but had their reality yanked out from under them. Let's make it personal. Imagine you're a widow. Let's call you Mrs. Cartwright. You've kept a small plot just outside the village for years. 4 rows of greens, a few onions, even a cherished rhubarb crown, passed down from your mother. Then one day a surveyor arrives with a clipboard and a smug expression. He hammers in some stakes, hands you a notice in language too dense to understand, and just like that, your cabbages are no longer yours. They belong to someone who now owns parcel for 7B. You're told you can rent access. You're also told the rent is due last week. So that night, Mrs. Cartwright walks out under cover of darkness and digs up 3 cabbages she planted with her own hands. Technically, she's now a criminal. She knows it. But what else is she meant to do? Historians still argue whether enclosure was a necessary evolution toward modern agriculture or a catastrophic blow to rural livelihoods. One side points to increased efficiency, better yields, and more organized production. The other points to mass displacement, grinding poverty, and you guessed it, surges in petty theft. Because where do you think those desperate folks turned? You cross a stile and find yourself in one of those disputed fields. It's lovely now. Neat rows, well-drained, orderly. But it wasn't always this way. And hidden under the order is a quiet hostility. People didn't just resent losing land, they resented the attitude that came with it. Wealthier landowners saw themselves as improving the countryside. They hired landscape designers, laid ornamental paths, and issued long, condescending pamphlets about the virtues of hard work and Christian stewardship. Meanwhile, the villagers they displaced were eating soup without vegetables, and so, tensions simmered. Not loud revolts, at least not most of the time, but acts of rebellion. And guess what form those sometimes took? Yep. Cabbage theft. Not random, not for hunger, but symbolic. A way to say, you don't own me just because you fenced off what used to be mine. Some of the most infamous cabbage heists weren't about need at all. They were vengeance wrapped in green leaves. Here's a quirky gem. In one Devon village, anonymous notes began appearing in church pews, signed the Brassica Brigand. The writer claimed responsibility for stealing prized garden cabbages from the local magistrate's garden and redistributing them to hungry families. Think Robin Hood meets compost? Whether the notes were serious or a prank is still debated, but the panic they caused was real. Lockboxes were installed. Dogs were hired. One man even suggested arming the town crier. There were also tales of villagers who'd returned stolen cabbages at night boiled, adored, and politely wrapped in linen with a note saying, "Thank you for the loan. It was delicious." Now that might be apocryphal. But it shows the cultural tension bubbling beneath what seems like a very sleepy topic. You lean against a tree now, the smell of moss rising in the damp. Far across the field, you spot a pair of distant lanterns. Watchmen, maybe? Or just 2 lads walking home? Hard to say. But you can feel it now, the mood that turned ordinary gardens into guarded fortresses, that made neighbors suspicious of each other, and that made once friendly landowners clutch their keys a little tighter. All it took was one act, fencing off what had once been open, a physical line drawn in the soil. And suddenly, everything changed. Cabbages weren't just a side dish anymore. They were a statement of ownership, of exclusion, of resistance. You close your eyes just for a moment. The earth feels firm beneath you. Somewhere nearby, something rustles, perhaps just a rabbit, or a thief returning what used to be his dinner. You brush a few leaves from your coat and keep walking, the dirt road narrowing into something more like a trail. A low fog clings to the hedgerows now, softening the landscape, making the world feel quieter, more suspicious. This is where things start to turn from tense to truly paranoid, because in Georgian England, when something valuable gets stolen often enough, it stops being a joke. It becomes a threat. And threats demand enforcement. So tonight, You've stepped into the muddy, menorah-scented world of early rural law enforcement. And yes, cabbage theft was on their radar. Picture the setup. You're living in a tiny village with no official police force, no uniforms, and absolutely no one being paid to care about your missing vegetables. What you've got instead is the local constable, a part-time, poorly trained man who may or may not have other jobs to do like thatching roofs or selling cider. And if he's not available, you've got watchmen who are basically just nosy neighbors with a lantern and a bad attitude. They're not CSI experts. They won't dust your cabbage patch for fingerprints. But if you report a theft, they might squint at the scene, grumble a bit, and then wander off to ask around, which is about as helpful as yelling your problems at a sheep. Still, the threat of being investigated was enough to put some cabbage thieves on edge. Because justice in rural England wasn't about fairness, it was about humiliation. If caught, you could be fined a painful amount, paraded in stocks in the village square, or sentenced to several weeks in the House of Correction, scrubbing stones or picking oakum alongside drunks and chimney boys for a cabbage. And yes, it happened. There is a record of one such punishment from 1783. In Lincolnshire, a man named Peter Hobbs was sentenced to 7 days in the town stocks for feloniously uprooting 3 heads of Savoy cabbage from the property of a Mr. Tanner Esquire. Feloniously. You almost expect the Cabbages to take the stand and testify. Historians still argue whether such punishments were common, or if these examples were more symbolic, meant to send a message rather than routinely enforced. Either way, the message was clear. Don't touch what's not yours, even if it's leafy and edible. Here's the odd bit, though. Enforcement wasn't always consistent. In wealthier areas like those near London, estate owners hired private guards to patrol their grounds at night. These garden keepers were sometimes armed with cudgels or even pistols. You did not want to be mistaken for a cabbage thief near one of these guys. One false step and you might end up face first in a turnip bed. But in poorer, more isolated villages, justice was often handled, let's say, informally. Some locals took cabbage protection into their own hands. Booby traps were real, everything from tripwires made of twine to stringing bells between rows. One eccentric widow was said to scatter flour across her garden paths at night so she could identify footprints in the morning. Whether it worked is unclear. Whether her neighbors thought she was unhinged. Almost certainly. And then there were informants. Yes. Nothing fuels paranoia like someone quietly watching. Maybe it's the boy who helps clean out the stable, or the neighbor who always seems to know what's cooking. A sudden rise in cabbage thefts. Suddenly everyone's looking sideways at the village idiot, or the new tenant, or heaven help us, the vicar's son. Which brings us to a quirky little side case, the cabbage conspiracy of Catterick, a local scandal that unfolded in the 1790s. It began when 3 households reported cabbage theft on the same week. Suspicion quickly fell on a young boy named Giles, whose father had recently died, leaving the family in poverty. But here's where it turns. The real thief turned out to be a local bakeress apprentice, who was taking the cabbages, baking them into pies, and selling them under the name Autumn Surprise. Historians love this one. Not just because it's strange and almost charming, but because it shows how theft morphed into micro-enterprise. When caught, the apprentice was fined, scolded, and famously forbidden from touching brassicas for 6 months. A punishment that was oddly specific, oddly British, and oddly satisfying. But beneath the jokes, there's something more unsettling. You see, fear of cabbage theft wasn't just about vegetables. It was about control. When that control felt threatened, rural communities clamped down hard. In some places, this meant posting public notices. Imagine a parchment nailed to the church door, written in florid ink, declaring, "Let it be known that any persons found disturbing the produce of Church Lane Gardens shall be pursued with legal remedy and face fine or confinement." This includes, but is not limited to, theft of cabbages, onions, leeks, and such other greens as may be in season. You walk past one of those very doors now, weathered wood, rusty nails, the ghost of 1,000 proclamations. But public shame wasn't just institutional, it was personal. If you were accused, Evan, wrongly, you'd better have friends in town, because a bad reputation could cling like chimney soot. Parents would warn their children not to play with that Barlow boy because his uncle once lifted a marrow. Marriages were even affected. Imagine being jilted at the altar because your cousin pinched kale from a minister's plot, tragic, and just a little bit ridiculous. Still, even in all this, there were whispers of mercy. Some magistrates quietly dismissed cabbage cases as trivial. It's a vegetable, one is reported to have said, not a crown jewel. And some communities allowed poor families to harvest from the fringes of fields in exchange for small chore sweeping, firewood gathering, or pest control. So it wasn't all cold justice and pickled vengeance. There were pockets of compassion, fleeting, fragile, but real. You reach the top of a hill now, overlooking a sleepy patchwork of fields. Cabbages glow softly in the moonlight, tround, harmless, and oddly powerful. And somewhere far below a watchman yawns, wondering if tonight's the night someone dares rustle the greens. The hill slopes gently beneath your feet, and your boots squish through soft, wet turf as you descend back into the sleepy folds of Georgian farmland. You pass another row of cabbages this time, tightly wrapped, dew glistening off their puckered leaves. They look peaceful, innocent even. But you know better now, 'cause here's the twist. It wasn't just about theft. No, in some cases, stealing cabbages became a form of rural resistance. You might not own land, you might not vote, and you certainly couldn't out-argue. Lawyer with powdered wigs and vowels as long as your arm, but you could steal a cabbage. And that meant something. So tonight, you'll follow the stories of those who weren't just taking vegetables. They were pushing back. You reach the edge of a narrow track, and something catches your eye. A small wooden post, maybe a former marker for field boundaries, and carved into it hurriedly is a cabbage. Not a symbol of hunger, a symbol of defiance. Now, let's talk about subsistence crimes, petty, usually non-violent thefts committed by those just trying to survive. Historians have long debated whether these crimes were acts of necessity, rebellion, or something blurrier in between. Picture the world these villagers lived in. Enclosure had swept through like a slow, bureaucratic wildfire. Common grazing lands, gone. Local wood for fire. Gated. Patches once shared freely now marked with signs that read private no trespass. What did that do to the psyche of someone who'd grown up believing the land was communal, part of an inherited rhythm of rural life? Well, one answer is clear. It bred quiet, cabbage-scented rebellion. Some folks responded with passive resistance, reusing old paths, planting sneaky little vegetables just beyond the line. Others went full brassica vigilante. There is a particularly cheeky story from Northamptonshire in 1791. A group of 3 women dressed in bonnets and heavy wool shawls were caught by moonlight sneaking into a wealthy landowner's plot, but not to steal cabbages. No, they were replanting them. That's right, replanting. They brought stolen cabbage seedlings from the landlord's own nursery and tucked them into the soil just beyond his new hedge. Land that had once been part of the commons. When questioned, they claimed they were simply helping the soil remember its duty. One of them winked. The magistrate was apparently not amused. This blend of sarcasm and symbolism wasn't rare. In fact, in several areas across southern England, small nighttime raids became known as brassica marches. No violence. No looting. Just vegetables moved from private plots back onto common soil or sometimes even deposited on the village green like trophies. Were these actual organized protests? Or just a few spirited souls acting out? Historians still argue whether these acts were spontaneous or coordinated rural resistance. But either way, they made a point. The people hadn't agreed to this new order. You wander through a grove of trees, the leaves barely rustling above, so quiet you can hear the gentle murmur of a brook nearby. Picture someone crouched low beside it, sack over their shoulder, cabbage inside, breath held as they wait for the watchman to pass. Not a thief, they might tell you. Just someone reclaiming dinner. And yet, the social cost was steep. Being caught meant more than a fine. It could mean social ostracism. Families known for theft were quietly excluded from village events, refused credit at the grocer's, or seen as morally tainted. But that stigma didn't always stop the stealing. Sometimes it made people bolder. Because once you're labeled a cabbage thief, well, you might as well earn the title. Let's detour for a moment to meet old Jonah Sharp, a former plowman turned folk hero in parts of Yorkshire. The story goes that Jonah, after losing his grazing rights during an enclosure ruling, began an unusual campaign of edible vengeance. Each week, he'd sneak into a landowner's garden, steal exactly one cabbage, and leave behind a carefully folded note. The notes were poetic, rhymed, signed yours in hunger and memory, J.S. One read, you fenced my future with iron and greed, so I take this leaf for it's all that I need. Another simply said, a bite of this, and you'll taste your crime. Was he real? Was he multiple people? A myth cooked up over cider? Historians still argue whether old Jonah ever lived, but letters in local archives suggest someone really was delivering handwritten rhymes in place of cabbage cores. And those letters made people nervous, because here's the unspoken fear. Theft meant disobedience, and disobedience spreads. Can't have the lower orders thinking they get to ignore the rules, or worse, that they're right to do so. So while some landowners ramped up security, more fences, more dogs, even bribes to neighbors, others tried to appease the situation. Cabbage allotments were sometimes established on the village edge, where the poorest could grow a small patch without crossing lines. Not out of kindness, mind you, out of damage control. Still, resentment simmered. And in this leafy, absurd theater of resistance, cabbages became the starring prop. You pass another plot now, abandoned. Weeds overtaking what once were tidy rows. A busted wheelbarrow rusts in the corner. You can almost see the ghost of a gardener, pushing it along, hoping no one noticed a few extra heads missing. Was it desperation, defiance, or just dinner? It's hard to say. What's clear is that in a world tilted by enclosure, surveillance, and suspicion, stealing a cabbage could feel like your last remaining vote. Not cast in a ballot box, but in soil, in hunger, in hope. You step over a low fancy zed now and feel, for just a second, the rush of danger those villagers might have felt. The thrum of rebellion, hiding in the leaves of a vegetable. And you keep walking, deeper into the story, where resistance grows not with fire or slogans, but with silent hands, dirt-streaked faces, and the quiet crunch of cabbage stalks underfoot. The path narrows now, worn down by centuries of boot steps, carts, and livestock hooves. Mist hangs heavier than before, curling low around the ankles of hedges. Like it, too, is eavesdropping. You pass an old boundary stone, half buried in moss, with a crooked P carved into it, maybe for parish, or maybe property, or maybe just a warning. This bit of land belongs to someone, because if cabbage theft was the act, subsistence was the motive. Then this next part, well, this is where it all escalates. I've made it to the grand estates now, land as far as the eye can see. Perfect hedgerows, endless rows of crops. Ornamental gardens so well-trimmed you half expect a peacock to saunter out with a monocle. And behind all of it, the country house. Tall, stone, unapologetically smug. Tonight, we are re-peeling back the ivy-covered curtain on how wealthy landowners responded to cabbage theft, Dan. How things got, well, weirdly serious. You see, the gentry didn't take kindly to the idea that someone might sneak onto their land, stoop low, and pluck one of their precious cabbages. Not because they'd missed the vegetable, but because it implied they'd lost control. And if there's one thing Georgian elites hated more than a dry claret, it was losing control. So they got inventive, some posted guards. So others raised stone walls, an expensive but aesthetically dramatic solution. But many turned to something even stranger. Horticultural traps. Yes, that's a thing. The idea was simple: make the garden itself hostile. Some landowners planted thorny bushes at cabbage perimeter edges, hoping to discourage sneaky hands and bare ankles. One particularly paranoid baronet reportedly experimented with planting stinging nettles between cabbage rows to teach a lesson through the skin. Another estate in Derbyshire used goose patrols. It's not just for security goose intimidation. These were specially raised birds, aggressive and loud. Rumor says they wore tiny leather anklets, so they'd clomp loudly at night like feathery sentries. Honestly, if you've ever been hissed at by a goose, you know this was probably very effective. Of course, some landowners went full Home Alone. Hidden wires, bells rigged to cabbage heads. A baronet named Sir Lionel Heathcote is said to have installed a primitive trip. Mechanism pull one cabbage too hard, and a rake would swing from a tree like something out of a cartoon. Did it work? Unclear. Did it sound like the ravings of a man with too much free time and not enough friends? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated or even real. But in estate records and letters, the tone is unmistakable. They felt under siege. And in response, they fortified their greens like castles. And then came the signs. The signs. Not polite warnings. These were full-on Gothic threats, scrawled in looping script, sometimes adorned with skulls or devilish flourishes. Some warned of legal ruin. Others threatened the wrath of God. One just said, "Steal the knot, lest worms take your legs." Cheery stuff, but not all deterrents were physical. Some were theatrical. Take Lord Penneforth of Sussex, who in 1795 began staging mock trials in his garden. He'd dress servants in borrowed robes, position a cabbage in the dock, and dramatically sentence it to death for conspiring against the crown. Neighbors were invited to watch, tea was served, cabbage was eaten, and somewhere in the chaos of roleplay, the actual point property paranoia got completely buried under aristocratic absurdity. That's the thing about Georgian landowners. They loved a bit of pageantry. You pass a crumbled garden wall now, its stones slick with moss, half swallowed by weeds. Was this once a fortified cabbage perimeter? A battleground between pride and produce? It's hard to say. But you do wonder what secrets those gardens held, because let's be clear, it wasn't about vegetables. It was about class. To steal a cabbage from a peer's land wasn't just theft, it was insult. It said, "Your power doesn't scare me. Your fences don't hold me. Your garden isn't sacred." That's why punishments for cabbage theft on estates were often harsher than in villages. Trespassing itself was a crime. But add in property damage and malicious theft, and you were looking at serious consequences. There are records of servants being dismissed, families evicted, even young boys sent to workhouses for a single head of stolen cabbage. And still, it kept happening. Because hunger doesn't read signs. It doesn't tiptoe past thorns. Doesn't care that a goose is honking in your face. Hunger takes the risk. One of the most famous cases came from Warwickshire, where a young stable hand was caught stealing not cabbages, but cabbage seed. Why? So he could grow his own patch at home and sell the surplus. The landowner tried to have him prosecuted for industrial theft, which, while dramatic, wasn't technically a legal term. In the end, the boy was let off with a warning, but not before being forced to return the seeds. Every last one, counted and measured. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. And then, just as you start to think these people couldn't take themselves more seriously, someone breaks the pattern. In a letter from 1802, a dowager countess in Wiltshire writes, "I find the theft of my brassicas amusing, for I cannot imagine any soul in such distress as to risk 1's honor for a cabbage. Let them take it. I shall plant more." A rare moment of grace, or maybe just fatigue. Either way, it stands out. You leave the estate lands behind now, ducking under a drooping oak branch. Behind you, the imagined honks of ghostly geese fade into the distance. Ahead, the fields flatten again, open and darker. The air smells of loam and wet leaves. And you can't help but wonder, was this all really about cabbages? Or were those leafy heads just the most absurd hill Englishmen could choose to die on? Either way, you press on, past signs that once read private, and fences once meant to keep you out, because now you're in the thick of it. The cabbage wars are far from over. You brush aside a curtain of damp ivy, stepping out into flatter, wind-lashed farmland. A rook cries out in the distance, its wings slicing through the early fog. And somewhere ahead you hear a gate creak open, just once, before silence returns. There's no one else out here. They're just you, the wind, and the secrets of stolen cabbages swirling in the soil beneath your feet. But don't be fooled by the quiet, because by now, the humble theft of a cabbage isn't just a whisper in the hedgerow at S, a full-blown legal headache. And in this stretch of the journey, you're heading straight into the wooden-beamed, smudged heart of courtrooms and punishments. That's right, you're going to trial. You cross the threshold into a Georgian magistrate's court, no grand palace of justice here. Just a small village hall, chilly even in June, with pews scraped by generations of tense legs, and a judge's bench that smells faintly of pipe smoke and varnish. The room carries a low, constant hum of unease. Like everyone here knows that cabbage crimes are not quite ridiculous enough to ignore, but never serious enough to handle without blushing. Still, the legal system had to respond. And respond it did with a level of bureaucratic zeal that bordered on surreal. You see, stealing cabbages or any food crop really fell under the broad category of larceny. But with a twist, larceny from a garden was treated as a specialized offense. Lawmakers were terrified that if you let one cabbage go, you'd soon have half the parish elbow deep in stolen parsnips and a full-scale veg-based uprising on your hands. So they cracked down. Punishments could range from public shaming to imprisonment. In some cases, repeat offenders were sentenced to transportation. Yes, transportation to the colonies, often Australia. Imagine explaining that to your fellow convicts on the boat. So what did you do? Murder. You. Forgery. You took a cabbage. And before you chuckle too hard, know this. It happened more than once. One poor soul, Thomas Fielding of Kent, was caught with 3 stolen cabbages in 1806. He was sentenced to 7 years of transportation. 7. For cabbages. Not even ripe ones. Reportedly, he was nabbed before harvest. Historians still argue whether magistrates genuinely believed these punishments would deter theft, or if they were simply flexing authority for show. Either way, the cabbage courts were in full swing by the early 1800s. You sit at the back of an imaginary courtroom now, shoulders hunched against the draft. In front of you stands the accused, a wiry man in patched breeches, holding his cap in both hands like it might save him from the law. He's accused of lifting 2 green-stuffed globes from a baronet's kitchen garden. The witness is the gardener, red in the face, claiming he saw the theft at precisely 7:14 p.m. Under the eye of the full moon, which illuminated the criminal act most clearly. No one questions how a cabbage was valued at 4 shillings, more than a week's wages for many laborers. No one questions why the theft is being heard with the same gravity as burglary, because this is Georgian England and order must be maintained. One fringe case from Gloucestershire in 1811 tells of a woman, Margaret Bell, who was brought to trial not for stealing cabbages, but for knowingly consuming cabbage stolen by another. Her husband had taken the vegetable from a squire's garden. She cooked it. That was enough for a charge of receiving stolen goods. Her defense, he brought it home. I boiled it. Her sentence, 3 days in the stocks. That's where we pause, by the way. The stocks. Used to humiliate petty criminals, they were a popular punishment for cabbage theft. Especially when local courts wanted to send a message without committing to prison space. Picture it. Ankles locked into place, maybe wrists too. In the middle of the village green, and while you sit there, cold and immobile, villagers wander by and judge. Sometimes heckle, sometimes throw things vegetables, mostly, hopefully not cabbages. That'd be ironic. And yet many accepted the punishment rather than plead for mercy. Sometimes defiance came even in the sentence. You might sit in the stocks and smile, 'cause you ate that cabbage. And no one can take that moment of rebellion from you. But the legal system didn't always work against the poor. Occasionally, juries intervened in sly, subtle ways. In London, a jury in 1802 downgraded a theft from larceny to vagrancy just to spare a woman from transportation. Why? Because she had 5 children and had not taken more than a man might eat in one meal. The judge scowled. The gallery clapped. There were also sympathetic constables, local peacekeepers, who knew the line between desperation and delinquency. Yet some would fail to find evidence or forget to pass along complaints. These small acts of quiet mercy rarely made the papers, but lived on in oral histories and village gossip. Still, others weren't so lucky. You pass a crumbling jail cell now, no larger than a closet. The door creaks as it swings open, and inside hangs the musty smell of damp straw and regret. Some poor cabbage criminals spent nights here, listening to rats scuffle nearby, counting down the days until freedom or exile. And in every one of those dusty, cramped spaces, a question hung in the air. Was it worth it? Sometimes the answer was yes. Because to take that cabbage meant you weren't beaten yet. You were hungry, maybe humiliated, but not powerless. And so, courtrooms filled with cabbage thieves. Not because they were especially criminal, but because they were visible. Easy targets. Proof that the system was functioning. You can't fix land inequality overnight, but you can absolutely prosecute someone for yanking a leafy ball from a forbidden garden. The system churned on. One judge, exasperated by the frequency of such cases, said to have grumbled in court, "By God, we should hang the whole village and start anew." He was joking, probably. You pass the courthouse now? Its windows glowing dimly from within. A gavel strikes in your imagination, and a sentence is passed. Another cabbage thief, another cold cell, another whisper in the archive, and still the vegetables grow. A thin ribbon of moonlight guides your path now, turning the wet grass silver as you meander toward lower, marshier ground. Each step is a little squishier than the last. Somewhere nearby, a frog croaks, almost like it's offering commentary on what's come before. You've witnessed courtrooms, cages, and cabbage-baiting baronets. But now it's time to get a little closer to the root of the matter, literally. Tonight, you squat beside the earth, fingertips brushing loamy soil, and examine the thing at the heart of all this fuss, the cabbage itself. Because here's the twist, you ready? This wasn't just a vegetable. In Georgian England, the cabbage held a kind of weird, layered symbolism. It was common, yes, but also cultivated. Low class, yet oddly prestigious, when grown large and symmetrical. This humble brassica had a strange cultural weight. And understanding why Georgian society obsessed over it means digging into both its botanical quirks and its class connotations. Let's start with the literal. The cabbage is a biennial, which means it takes 2 years to complete its full life cycle. In its first year, it forms the tight, leafy head we're familiar with. If you don't harvest it, the second year it shoots up into a tall stalk and flowers something most people never see. Why? Because they eat it first. But in Georgian gardens, letting a few cabbages bolt and bloom was actually trendy. Why? Because the flowers drew bees, and bees meant honey, and honey meant wealth. So yes, sometimes a cabbage plant would be grown not to eat, but to lure bees like a leafy little bait station. That's your fringe fact for the night. Some aristocrats grew cabbages on purpose just to sweeten their mead. Now culturally, cabbages were ... complicated. On one hand, they were peasant food, boiled to oblivion, often seasoned with nothing but salt, if you were lucky. On the other hand, there was a growing bourgeois trend toward culinary cabbage cultivation. Think recipe books, bragging about braised Savoy in butter and mace. Picture a candlelit supper where someone praises the tightness of the leaf curl like it's a bottle of aged claret. You can almost hear the Georgian equivalent of a foodie blog. We only serve cabbages from the western slope garden. They're less aggressive. And therein lay the absurdity. The poor grew cabbages to survive. The rich grew them to curate their gardens. But once you'd invested status into the vegetable ones, it became part of your ornamental aesthetic. Your kitchen identity, your symbolic control over the land, any theft of it, became personal. You crouch beside a withered stalk now, long past harvest, its yellowed leaves flaking off like pages in a diary. There are insects here, softly ticking in the dark. A slug inches along the outer rim. And you imagine someone long ago, maybe a tenant farmer, stealing through the dark, carefully choosing a head and slicing it free with a sharpened spoon, not because it was worth a fortune, but because it was something they could actually hold. A victory, even if just for a night. Now let's talk shapes. Yes, cabbage shapes were a thing. The tightness of the cabbage head was a mark of success. Loose-leafed, floppy cabbages were ridiculed in markets. In fact, there are notes from 18th century cookbooks warning that an untamed cabbage shall render the meal shameful, utterly dramatic, but understandable when you realize that neatness was morality. A well-formed cabbage suggested good seed, careful tending, and obedience to nature's rules. Historians still argue whether this obsession with cabbage orderliness reflected deeper fears about social decay. After all, a neat cabbage meant a neat garden. A neat garden meant a neat household. And a neat household meant everything was under control. If your cabbages started flopping, what was next? Women wearing trousers? You chuckle softly, but it's truth the way people talked about gardens in Georgian England often mirrored how they talked about society. And cabbages, being at once accessible and highly symbolic, became a kind of edible battleground between aesthetic and survival. This brings us to kitchen gardens, which were half laboratory, half showroom. Large estates would have whole sections devoted to growing cabbages, not just for eating, but for impressing. The varieties alone were staggering: Savoy drumhead, red Dutch, January king. Each had a different texture, leaf ruffle, or seasonal profile. Gardeners would compete quietly over who could grow the largest head without it splitting. In fact, one horticultural journal from 1799 records a cabbage weighing over 40 pounds being entered into a harvest contest. The footnote simply reads, "Grown with pride in rainwater." And yes, people cheated. There are rumors of cabbages being stuffed their roots, hollowed and filled with moist sand to increase weight. Others were allegedly steamed with kettle-poured water the night before, judging to fluff up the outer leaves, all for a ribbon. And maybe a plate of goose afterward. So while peasants stole cabbages to eat, the wealthy pampered them like house cats. One Surrey noblewoman is said to have spoken to hers during moonlit walks, referring to her patch as her green congregation. Whether that's true or not, you'll never know, but it's too deliciously strange not to repeat. You shuffle past a row of faint indentations in the earth cabbage beds long since dug up. The moon's behind a cloud now, and the chill returns. A gust of wind rattles the hedgerows. And for a moment, you imagine the leaves whispering, not with menace, but mischief. Because if anything is clear by now, it's this. The cabbage was never just a vegetable. It was a statement. To grow one was to declare control over land and time. To steal one was to challenge that order. And to eat one, well, that was just good sense. So next time someone tells you cabbage is boring, remember people lied. People schemed. People quite literally risked exile for this crunchy, sulfur-scented icon. And as you wander deeper into the dark garden of history, the soil crunching softly beneath your shoes, realize you're not really walking among plants anymore. You're walking through power, through pride, through pickled ambition and boiled rebellion, and it still smells. Your boots press softly into the sodden path as the trees begin to part again. A low mist clings to your calves like half-forgotten memories, and far ahead, just visible through the gauzy air, flickers a lantern swaying from a post outside a stone building. You're not heading to a home or a courtroom this time. You're walking straight into a tavern of smoky, sawdust-floored den where cabbage thefts are planned, remembered, and maybe even toasted over pints of warm ale. Because let's face it, for every cabbage thief who got caught and carted off, there were 10 more who didn't. And where do people go when they need to brag a little? Or blow off steam after a lucky raid on the manor garden? Or even just warm their frozen fingers after a midnight sprint from a shouting gardener? They go to the public house, of course, the beating heart of the village, or at least its liver. Oh yes, you push open the crooked tavern door. The hinges groan. Inside, a low fire crackles in the hearth, throwing shadows across thick wooden beams. The air smells of wet wool, pipe smoke, spilled beer, cabbage stew that's been reheated more times than anyone would admit. A fiddler drones lazily in the corner, half asleep. No one looks up right away. But you've walked into a very specific conversation. I told him it weren't his cabbage. Grew wild at the hedgerow, I says. Laughter. The kind that only comes from getting away with something. And you realize that for all the courtrooms and punishments, for all the desperate scrapes and close calls, cabbage theft had a secret second life. Folklore. These were stories passed pint to pint, stories that twisted and stretched with each telling until the humble cabbage became a stage for sly defiance and rustic heroism. Your cabbage thieves weren't criminals. They were legends, or at least a good laugh on a cold night. One popular tale tells of a man named Toby Trotter Elmsley, who in 1804 allegedly made off with 7 cabbages by hollowing out a large bread cart, hiding the greens under a layer of stale loaves, and selling both out of town. Supposedly, he managed this scam for 6 weeks before the baker got suspicious. What finally gave him away? Not the cart, not the smell, but the sheer amount of coleslaw he brought to a village picnic. That part is almost certainly fictional. But people loved these stories. They gave the powerless a kind of imaginary victory. In real life, stealing a cabbage meant risk. In tavern tales, it meant cleverness, outwitting the steward, dodging the dogs, triumphing over injustice, using nothing but nerve, hunger, and maybe a fast set of legs. Historians still argue whether these stories were a form of genuine protest or just entertainment. But it's clear they served a function moral inversion. 8. In these tales, the landowner was the fool, the thief was the star, and the cabbage, the prize. Who was said to carry a goose under one arm and a cabbage under the other, neither of which she'd ever paid for. Locals claimed she could sprint faster than the magistrate's horse when properly spooked. One farmer, when asked if he'd seen her stealing from his fields, replied, "No, but if I did, I'd thank her. She knows quality. Did she exist? No one knows." But there was probably a Nan Dory, maybe 10 of her. Women who scavenged the borders of the law, living on the edge of hunger and humor alike. And here's the fun twist. Even the rich weren't immune to these stories. Sometimes local squires and vicars would retell them at dinner parties, playing at rustic familiarity. You can imagine a powdered gentleman sipping claret and saying, "Ah yes, the cabbage caper of '05. Marvelous local color." Of course, they were never the butt of the joke. But still, the stories traveled. Class didn't stop a good yarn. You sip an imaginary mug of something warm and vaguely hoppy. Around you, the tavern hums with half-sung songs and fire-warmed laughter. It's easy to forget, in this moment, that there's a war on cabbage thieves outside these walls. Even songs emerged from the lore, little folk ditties with lines like, "I took it bold beneath the moon, a cabbage round and green as June. I boiled it soft and sang a tune, and dreamt I owned the land." Catchy? No? These verses weren't just tunes for children. They were memory tools. They preserved a time, a hunger, a sly kind of rebellion. When you couldn't write history, you sang it. And yes, some of those melodies stuck around in the backs of rural songbooks. Barely remembered, but still they're little musical crumbs of defiance. One fringe tidbit. In Devon, there was reportedly a superstition that eating a stolen cabbage on the first night of winter would bring prosperity. Maybe it was just a clever excuse to steal a cabbage. But a few accounts suggest people genuinely believed it brought luck, or at least warmth. So you have tales, you have songs, you have rituals. This is no longer just petty crime. It's folklore with legs. And legs matter, because every story needed a getaway. The thief who disappeared into the hedge, the child who rolled the cabbage down the hill and ran after it, accidentally scooping it up and sprinting home. These were the village houdinists, and the tavern never tired of hearing about them. You glance around the firelit room one last time, someone starting another verse. A girl in a red shawl holds up a wooden spoon, like a baton. There's a clunk of mugs, a murmur of agreement. And in the corner near the fire, an old man says, almost to himself, "They never did catch the one who took the Lord's prize Savoy. Just vanished, he did. Like smoke, and everyone nods, 'cause they want to believe it." So you slip back into the night, the door closing behind you with a sleepy sigh. And the stories trail after you, like steam from a kettle. You realize now that cabbage theft wasn't just an act, it was a narrative, told and retold, until it became part of the village's bloodstream. And no matter how many arrests or angry pamphlets or trials unfolded outside, the tavern always won in the end. Because you can jail a thief, but you can't jail a story. The tavern door swings shut behind you with a satisfying thunk, and once again you're swallowed by the mist. Only now your steps feel lighter, don't they? Almost buoyed by the memory of those warm laughs and whispered legends. But don't get too comfortable. You're not headed back to your warm bed just yet. Tonight your path winds into darker woods, where whispers of guilt and suspicion tangle in the branches. Because what happens when a cabbage is missing, but no one knows who took it? You're entering the jittery realm of cabbage paranoia, very real. It's a very weird atmosphere that crept through Georgian England's parishes, especially in lean years. This was less about theft and more about the fear of theft. And like a moldy head of cabbage left too long in the cellar, this fear had a way of rotting everything it touched. First things first, you must understand just how precarious the average rural life was. Most households didn't have much margin, financially, nutritionally, emotionally. A failed planting, a harsh frost, a sudden illness, and the whole system wobbled. So when you woke up one morning and saw that someone had snuck into your patch, maybe not even taken the biggest head, just a modest one, you didn't shrug. You fumed, or panicked. Or if you were a certain kind of person, you marched directly to your neighbor's fence and accused them of being a cabbage-snatching degenerate. These weren't always dramatic arrests, so often they were quiet civil breakdowns. Friendships frayed, marriages soured. Parish records contain more than a few accounts of domestic disputes sparked by accusations of missing vegetables. One line in a vicar's notes reads simply, "Mr. Franks slapped his cousin over a cabbage." The matter was unresolved. That's one way to ruin Sunday dinner. It wasn't just neighbors either. Servants were frequently suspected, especially the young ones. Garden boys, kitchen girls, milkmaids, sent out at dusk. One wealthy gentleman in Kent allegedly fired his scullery maid not because she stole a cabbage, but because she looked satisfied while standing near them. That's right. She was fired for suspicious joy. Paranoia. Didn't stop at the estate walls either. Communities began installing cabbage deterrents. You ready for this? Some folks tied threadbare bells or spoons to stalks so they'd clang if disturbed. Others dabbed cabbage leaves with goose fat mixed with chalk meant to stain the fingers of anyone who touched them. Sort of a low-tech ink trap. And then there were the decoys. Yes, you heard that right. Fake cabbages. In at least 2 recorded cases, landowners created dummy cabbage heads bundles of green-dyed cloth or carved root vegetables to lure and identify would-be thieves. One particularly creative squire even filled his with soot and placed it at the edge of his garden, hoping to mark the culprit. Historians still argue whether these decoy efforts were widespread or isolated eccentricities. But the documentation suggests more than a few gardeners got experimental when fear gripped the village. And sometimes the fear turned legal. You might recall the harsh punishments we discussed earlier. But beyond those formal trials, there were preemptive accusations, summons issued to people who hadn't been caught doing anything, but were likely to offend. A man in Wiltshire was brought before the magistrate, simply because he walks in the direction of cabbages each night. That's it. No theft. Just suspicious strolling. These were the early whispers of something modern ears might recognize. Profiling. People being watched, distrusted, sometimes punished, based on their poverty or presence alone. It's cabbage theft as social paranoia, something much stickier than a single stolen plant. At the same time, the fear was justified, wasn't it? You can feel it. That itch in your spine when you've got only 2 cabbages left, and they're all that's standing between your family and an empty stew pot. If one disappears, what then? You pause under a gnarled tree, above you an owl hoots, sudden and sharp. For a moment, you picture yourself on both sides of this cabbage standoffs, stealing and being stolen from. The thief stomach growling, creeping barefoot through the dark. The grower sleepless, ear to the window, clutching a poker. It's not a tale of good and evil. It's a feedback loop of scarcity, shame, and sheer nervous survival. In this environment, even children weren't safe from suspicion. Some parishes instituted informal curfews, barring unwatched youth from gardens after dusk. One poor boy 9 years old was caught playing with a hoop near the vicaress cabbage patch and brought home in disgrace. The mother's reply, scrawled angrily in the court note, "He's afraid of cabbages. Won't even eat him boiled." And yet, it was enough. One glimpse of a child's shadow where a cabbage used to be, and the social fabric began to fray. Even church sermons took a turn. A few particularly severe clergy began using cabbage theft as a metaphor for moral decay. They warned of the creeping sins, small daily disobediences that, like nibbling at a garden edge would, eventually erode a community's soul. Imagine hearing that on a Sunday morning while your stomach growled and the frost still clung to your boots. It makes you wonder, did anyone actually believe in the cabbage's moral power? Or was it just a scapegoat and edible excuse for everything falling apart? Because the truth is, in a system as fragile as Georgian rural life, it didn't take much to crack the surface. A stolen cabbage wasn't just food. It was a symbol of trust broken, of order slipping, of dignity slipping through calloused fingers. And paranoia loves symbols. So by the time another cabbage went missing, one that maybe just rotted in place or was taken by a rabbit, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Eyes narrowed. Voices whispered. Lines were drawn. It's funny in a way. You could live next to someone for years, swap tools, share stew, chase geese from each other's fences. But one missing cabbage that could turn kin into enemies? And this paranoia, like a sour wind, lingered. Even today, some of those old garden rows, long abandoned, still seem to lean away from the footpath like they remember. You take a step forward, you're still. The wind has calmed. But you can feel the weight of all those unspoken accusations, the ones that never made it to court. But still split families, frayed friendships, or left a child wondering why no one waved anymore. Cabbage theft was a crime, yes. But cabbage paranoia? That was the quiet kind of violence, the one no one ever got tried for. And maybe, in its own way, it did more damage than any stolen leaf. You leave the tangled web of suspicion behind, stepping past the last whispering hedgerows of cabbage paranoia. The night air feels clearer now, cooler on your cheeks. But don't get to relax, your path veers off again, this time toward an altogether stranger horizon. You see, tonight, we're not just following thieves or listening to tavern tales. We're entering the minds of those who believed cabbage theft could be measured, patterned, and perhaps prevented. You're walking toward early proto-criminology, the Georgian version of a detective show. Minus the sunglasses and way more turnips. Now, hold on to your bonnet, because Georgian England did not yet have a modern police force. That wouldn't come until Sir Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act in 1829. Before that, law enforcement was a patchwork of part-time watchmen, parish constables, and overworked magistrates, but that didn't stop a certain kind of Georgian thinker-clergyman, gentlemen, farmers, and reform-minded scribblers from trying to understand crime. And yes, that includes cabbage theft. They started keeping what we might now call crime journals. Dry little ledgers that when you flip through them are absolutely teeming with garden drama. Lines like, noted loss of Savoy from lower bed, no visible footmarks, suspect child or woman, or 3 cabbages gone again, windward fence still intact, set a trap of cord and pan result. 2 cats, no thief. You begin to realize these people weren't just protecting their vegetables, they were documenting patterns, looking for trends, tracking methods. Some even mapped which cabbages went missing and when, as if the leaves themselves were whispering secrets. And here comes the quirky bit. Some amateur sleuths began assigning moral qualities to vegetables. That's right. In one very odd pamphlet from 1792, a rural curate argues that honest men plant carrots, cautious men potatoes, and rogues favor the cabbage for its loose concealment. Now you and I both know that's bonkers. But in a time with few tools and even fewer scientific methods, people grasped at whatever explanations they could. Cabbages became psychological clues. The softer the head, the sneakier the crime. Historians still argue whether these observations helped form the roots of real criminology, or if they were just agrarian superstition dressed up in academic frills. Either way, they reflected a hunger for order, for sense-making in a world that so often didn't make sense. One early thinker worth mentioning was Reverend Giles Weatherby, who lived in Hampshire and was something of a cabbage detective enthusiast. His diary contains the following line. Of those apprehended for taking produce, most favor the green Savoy. I suspect a connection between its tangled leaves and their twisted conscience. Did it hold up under scrutiny? Absolutely not. But Weatherby's records did something important. They recorded patterns of behavior. Who stole, when they stole, what they took. He wasn't a modern sociologist, but he was trying to understand the link between poverty, opportunity, and temptation. That curiosity would bloom into the fuller social studies of the next century. Another fringe practice, garden profiling, not of people, but of layouts. Some gentlemen began publishing diagrams of their garden defenses in local papers, hoping to outthink thieves. You'd see tips like, plant the less desirable varieties at the perimeter, let thieves have the woody leaves, save the hardier specimens for the inner beds. A sort of cabbage Magina line, really. Others advocated for the use of dogs, claiming that cabbage thieves were uniquely afraid of barking. and thus a single yappy terrier could preserve a season's worth of slaw. One landowner even experimented with scent marking his rows using soaked leather belts, hoping the odd smell would confuse trespassers into avoiding his crop. Yet for all their efforts, most of these gentlemen were spectacularly bad at catching actual criminals. They wrote about cabbage loss the way someone might write about crop circles mystified, frustrated, deeply convinced something nefarious was going on, but with little to show beyond muddy footprints and misplaced blame. And then there was the more spiritual angle. Some moral thinkers believed that cabbage theft could be reduced through virtue education, their theory. If you taught the poor proper value temperance, hard work, and vegetable restraint, they'd simply stop stealing. Entire pamphlets were devoted to the idea that cabbage crime was a failure of moral fiber, not hunger. One pamphlet, hilariously titled Greens and Grievances, claimed, "No stomach, however empty, should override a man's duty to property. Let him chew on pride if cabbage be lacking." That's easy to say when your pantry's full of veal pies, isn't it? Still, these ideas mattered. They laid the groundwork for a shift from viewing theft purely as sin to seeing it as a social symptom. And this shift would become critical when modern criminology finally emerged. Imagine it. Somewhere between the soot-stained fields and the ink-stained journals. People were starting to ask not just who stole the cabbage, but why does someone feel the need to? That's not nothing. That's progress. It wasn't limited to rural thinkers. In London, where hunger and theft collided daily, early magistrates began logging urban vegetable thefts as distinct categories. City gardens, kitchen plots, and even grocers' carts were vulnerable to fast hands and faster feet. One clerk noted that cabbage theft rose significantly near holidays when food prices spiked and pickings grew thin. Another noted that cabbage thefts dropped when workhouses served stews more frequently. Patterns. Always patterns. So tonight, you walk alongside these strange proto-detectives. Their methods were crude, their biases thick. But they tried. And in trying, they did what all humans do when they feel the world slipping sideways. They documented. They theorized. They imagined control. And that desire to understand, Evan, when misdirected, is weirdly comforting. Because while their cabbage traps and character charts didn't stop much, they told future generations one important thing. People were watching. Not with perfect vision, not without mistakes, but with the hope that, if they could just make sense of why someone would risk so much for a single green head, maybe, just maybe, they could build a better system. And you're standing here now, in the long shadow of that hope. Looking back at the oddly serious notebooks of men who thought cabbages might explain the world. Maybe they weren't so wrong after all. And now, your shoes squelch a little. Not with mud, but bureaucracy. That's right. As you step deeper into Georgian England's leafy underbelly, you enter the world of paperwork, petitions, and parish records. Because when a cabbage disappeared and the whispers failed, the next step was often to write it down officially. You probably didn't think a stolen cabbage could generate so many forms. But oh, you sweet summer radish, it absolutely could. See, in rural England, most crimes didn't immediately leap into the laps of central courts. They passed through a kind of social civ parish authorities, local vestries, and informal mediation before anything dramatic happened. If someone pinched a cabbage and the accused lived nearby, the first step was usually not an arrest. It was a petition or a parish complaint. Let's picture it. You're standing in the dim hallway of your village church, a crumpled slip of paper in hand, trying to look both righteous and not entirely unhinged. The paper reads something like, "To the Honorable Vestryman, on the matter of my greens taken by unknown hands Tuesday last, I humbly seek notice, relief, and perhaps restitution in turn. The fence was not broken. The soil bears signs. My heart is sore, very dramatic. Georgian England was nothing, if not florid. From here, the vestry, those unpaid, occasionally drunken village bureaucrats might choose to call a hearing. These weren't proper courtrooms. They were meetings often held in taverns or back rooms, where 4 or 5 local men sat around deciding if your complaint warranted further action. Sometimes they'd call witnesses. Sometimes they'd just sigh, drink, and shrug. And here's the kicker. Very often the complaint was dropped, not because it lacked merit, but because the system had no time, no funds, and frankly, no real desire to pursue something as minor as a cabbage. You could steal a loaf of bread and risk hanging. But a Savoy head, that was administratively inconvenient. Still, the paperwork mattered, because every time someone wrote one cabbage taken without permission, they left a little breadcrumb for future historians and a trail of mounting tension in their community. But what if you did push the issue? Well, then you might find yourself in front of a Justice of the Peace, or JP. Now, JPs were the backbone of local law enforcement. They were wealthy landowners appointed to oversee minor cases, everything from quarrels to garden theft. Some were serious. Some were eccentric. All of them were very busy and often undertrained. Their job? Decide if your stolen cabbage warranted a fine, a whipping, or just a very stern lecture. One famous case from Norfolk involves a farmer who brought 3 witnesses and an actual cabbage stump as evidence. He claimed the cut marks matched his missing plant. The JP's response? He reportedly sniffed the stump, declared it lacking in character, and dismissed the case. That's right, the cabbage wasn't convincing enough. Still, some did result in sentences. Usually, these were fine small payments made by the accused, which they almost never could afford. In worse cases, poor offenders were tossed into the house of correction, where they'd be put to hard labor. Often working the same kinds of gardens they once stole from. Historians still argue whether these punishments had deterrent value, or just pushed desperate people further into the margins. The evidence is hazy, but the pattern is clear. Poverty plus paperwork equals punishment even when the crime was barely enough to fill a pot. One of the most tragically amusing features of this system was the cabbage oath. You'd swear before the vestry or the JP that the cabbage was truly yours and truly stolen. In some regions, it became almost ritualistic. One transcription reads, "I, being of sound mind and familiar hand, do attest this green and rounded leaf was mine by lawful toil, and now lies elsewhere by wicked hand." You're not hallucinating. Someone wrote that. But it wasn't all solemn vows. Occasionally, things took a sharp turn toward comedy. One man unironically named Mr. Green was accused of stealing cabbage from Mr. White. The vestry reportedly couldn't get through the hearing without laughing, dismissed both parties with a warning not to make salad of each other's tempers. Even the courts knew when to call it a day. And yet, even in absurdity, the system had weight. A single recorded complaint could stain your reputation for years. Parish records were often shared between towns. A note like "oft suspected of garden impropriety" might follow you through 3 counties. You didn't just lose your cabbage, you lost your standing. But here's the twist. Parish records also protected the innocent. More than once, careful documentation helped clear names, especially those of children or servants falsely accused. One entry details how a boy was blamed for a cabbage theft, only to have a neighbor come forward with a diary entry proving she had harvested it herself 2 days prior. Victory for honesty, a win for the written word. Still, you can't help but feel the system was uneven. If you were wealthy, the vestry listened. If you were poor, they sighed. If you were loud, they might scold. And if you were unlucky, they might punish Shivan when all you wanted was soup. And then there were the parish garden surveys. At least 2 parishes, both in Sussex, began issuing seasonal surveys to landowners, asking if they experienced vegetable losses. The idea was to map trends, spot problem areas, and maybe stop future thefts. It's believed these were early precursors to rural crime mapping, just done in ink and with much worse handwriting. Imagine filling out one of those surveys now. Name you, garden size, mediums, small, losses, 1 cabbage, 3 pride, suspect. Unseen, but I felt them. Notes, I'm just very tired. Same, so yes. The bureaucracy of Georgian England was tedious, inconsistent, occasionally hilarious, but not meaningless. Because through all the badly written petitions and dubiously sniffed cabbage stumps, a portrait began to form. A picture of a society trying, in its limited way, to grasp the everyday pain of scarcity, to write down the hurt before it turned into something worse. And tonight, you're tracing their ink-blotted footsteps. You're standing in their crowded vestry halls, listening to the scratching of quills and the muttered complaints of farmers who just wanted dinner. Sometimes justice came. Sometimes it didn't. But the cabbage once stolen always left a mark on paper, on memory. And on the slightly ridiculous legal history of a country that once feared the garden more than the gallows. By now, you've wandered through suspicious hedgerows, nosy neighbors, failed cabbage traps, and the perfumed absurdity of vestry paperwork. And just when you think it can get weirder, you find yourself strolling toward the theater of punishment. Yes, the consequences. Because Georgian England didn't just scold cabbage thieves. It performed justice, sometimes with flair, sometimes with farce, and nearly always with an uncomfortable mix of pettiness and severity. Picture this: a worn wooden platform, the scratch of straw underfoot, and a crowd gathered for what's listed as a public pillorying for cabbage theft. No, not a metaphor. A real-life punishment handed down in certain parishes when tempers ran hot and turnips ran low. The pillory, think of it as a humiliating wooden stock, was meant to shame the offender. Your head and hands were trapped, your face exposed to the elements, and the tomatoes, or in this case, often actual cabbage leaves hurled by delighted children and furious market women. And you not hallucinating if you've heard stories of people being hit with rotten greens? They happened. One 1786 account from Somerset reports a young man receiving a full week's humiliation and several dozen cabbages to the face, some fresh, some not. He reportedly wept. The crowd cheered. This kind of public punishment was meant to reinforce communal values. You weren't just paying for your cabbage crime, you were offering your embarrassment up as moral entertainment. And yet, paradoxically, some communities grew uncomfortable with this spectacle. Historians still argue whether public punishment reinforced law and order or simply hardened resentment. Some claimed it deterred theft. Others whispered that it made people root for the criminal, especially when the cabbage pincher was someone everyone knew was struggling. Remember? Theft wasn't always about greed. Often it was about cold nights, hungry mouths, and a patch of cabbages tempting you like a fat leafy angel in the moonlight. But the law didn't always leave room for nuance. Another punishment was the House of Correction, a grim little facility somewhere between jail and workhouse. Notorious for their strict discipline and forced labor, these houses often took and repeat cabbage offenders. Here, the punishment wasn't public shaming, but grinding monotony. Endless hours of stone breaking, textile work, or field tilling. One 1801 record describes a 12-year-old girl sentenced to a month's labor for taking a head of garden cabbage of the more tender kind. Her job at the correction house? Weeding the vegetable patch? Cruel irony, right? Even more absurd were symbolic punishments. These were especially popular in parishes that couldn't afford jail cells or where the vestry just wanted to prove a point. Sometimes cabbage thieves were forced to wear leaves pinned to their clothes, essentially marking them with their crime. Imagine walking through your village with a sad, wilted collar of green. It's like a failed superhero outfit, Captain Kale, but with zero powers and the constant smell of vinaigrette. One man was made to march around his village square 3 times holding a sign that read, "I stole from the soil. And now the soil shames me." You can't make this stuff up. Yet punishment wasn't all legal or ritualistic. Sometimes community vengeance filled the gap. If formal systems failed, angry neighbors might take it upon themselves to deliver justice. One diary from 1797 describes a group of women who, convinced that a widow had stolen from their garden plots, staged what they called a leaf storm. They surrounded her cottage and dumped several wheelbarrows of cabbages on her doorstep, mostly rotting, then chanted rhyming insults for over an hour. Unpleasant, yes, but impressively organized. There's even a fringe theory among historians that some of these punishments, especially the more performative ones, had folk roots echoes of older, pre-legal traditions where public shame was a kind of purification ritual. A strange mix of justice and theater, cabbage and curse. Some believed in restorative punishment, too. A few parishes experimented very briefly with what they called garden reconciliation. Instead of jail or fines, an offender would be required to work in the victim's garden for a period of time. In theory, this built understanding. In practice, it was awkward. One pair reportedly ended up married a year later. True story, or at least, a persistent village rumor. But even as punishments grew diverse, none truly addressed the core issue: why cabbage theft was happening at all. The system focused on shame and spectacle, not support. It responded to hunger with humiliation and to need with nonsense. And yet, through it all, punishment records became strangely poetic. Some parish books list Cabbage crimes with high-level precision: 2 stolen heads, fence bent but not broken. Punishment: 3 days soup duty. Or, green upon green, stolen from widow's yard, shame delivered. It's almost beautiful, right? If it weren't about petty larceny, you begin to feel the weight of this strange little history, its leafy absurdity masking deeper truths. How punishment became performance. How shame replaced understanding. How time and again a single cabbage could cause such a stir. There's also the unspoken reality. The poorer you were, the harsher the consequences. The punishment of a noble cabbage thief was rarely public. Often they paid a fine or received a discreet note from the magistrate suggesting they perhaps not do that again. But for common folk, punishment came with audience, drama, and often no second chances. It was a world where justice smelled faintly of compost and injustice lingered like wilted leaves. And you, walking now past the pillory post and the long-shuttered correction house, can't help but wonder, did it ever work? Did shame really save the cabbages? Or did it just harden hearts, deepen divides, and make life harder for the people who already had the least? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear. Georgian England knew how to make a spectacle out of scarcity. And while we might laugh now at leafy collars and vegetable parades of shame, the truth they tried to hide was much less funny. No one should have to steal a cabbage to survive. You rub your eyes, squinting through the soft candle glow of history, and realize you're approaching the final shadows of our journey. But before you collapse gently into a duvet of leafy absurdity, there's one more tangle of roots to stumble through. The aftermath. The quiet legacy of cabbage theft and how its leafy fingerprints lingered long after the pillories crumbled. Because what happens when society punishes the poor for stealing vegetables for 2 straight centuries? Something cultural. Let's start with food itself. By the mid-19th century, attitudes towards self-grown produce shifted dramatically. Where cabbage had once been a coveted staple and a source of tension. Between neighbors, it began to morph into a symbol of subsistence dignity. People didn't just grow food to eat anymore. They grew it to prove they could survive without stealing. Community gardens sprang up in towns and cities, especially during times of hardship. And guess what? Many of these plots were quietly backed by former vestry families. Maybe guilt made the rounds. Or maybe they were just sick of signing cabbage theft complaints. One 1852 pamphlet on the moral value of parsnips, written by an eccentric reverend in Surrey, urged local parishes to furnish land rather than punishment. And while most ignored him because parsnips have never inspired mass movements, a few did listen. They began parceling out public garden patches to poor families, planting a different kind of solution: preventative vegetables. Historians still argue whether this was a response to crime or charity. Was it a proactive kindness or a belated patch-up job? Either way, it reframed the cabbage not as a temptation, but a right. And that shift trickled into law too. By the late 1800s, petty theft of produce was being treated with increasing leniency. Magistrates began dismissing first-time offenses, often with warnings or small cautions instead of labor sentences. More than one judge openly joked, better a stolen cabbage than a stolen conscience. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than sniffing cabbage stumps in courtrooms. As for the poor, well, they remembered. Folk songs from the countryside began slipping cabbage theft into their verse, sometimes mournful, sometimes hilarious. One Sussex ballad, still sung at the odd harvest festival, tells of Billy Brown and his midnight greens, who stole 3 heads for his granny's soup and spent a week hoeing fields in shame. The chorus strangely upbeat. He ran through rows with mud on toes, for leaf and love and supper. Even children's rhymes joined in. There's an eerie old skipping song, probably Victorian, that ends with, "Steal the sprout, you wear the crown, thieves go marching up through town, leaves on lapels, heads held low, no one steals where cabbages grow." It's weirdly catchy. And yes, vaguely haunting, but folklore has a long memory, and so do institutions. Some of those parish record books we spoke of, they now sit in county archives, leafed through by local historians and bored graduate students. Inside, penciled between baptisms and burial lists, are the faint, spidery lines. September 12th. Mr. W. reports 3 cabbages taken. Accused. John, age 10. Resolution apology made. Or a young woman found with greens not her own. Offered recompense in labor and bread. These scraps don't tell you everything, but they hint. At struggle, at system strained, at moments where survival slips sideways into suspicion. And sometimes the smallest marginalia says the most. One 1799 entry includes this: "Let it be known. Hunger makes fools of us all, but I'd rather suffer a thief than see a man starve." No author, no explanation. Just a sliver of sympathy in a sea of regulations. But even now, in the modern world, these echoes remain. Think about it. Urban foraging, food banks, guerrilla gardening, all modern ways people fight food insecurity without relying on systems that often fail them. Today, we might not pillory cabbage thieves, but we still wrestle with who gets food, who grows it, and what it means to take it. Cabbage theft, in a twisted way, became a symbol of quiet rebellion, push against unjust systems, clothed in leaves and soaked in irony. And then there's the language. Ever heard someone say they're living off cabbage and hope? Is that phrase intraceable, in exact origin, started popping up in the late 19th century? It's become a poetic way to say, barely scraping by. And it's hard not to imagine it came from this tangled root system of hunger, theft, and stubborn green resilience. Even in comedy, the ghosts of Georgian garden crimes still sprout. One Edwardian stage farce, The Curious Case of the Cabbage Courting, poked fun at a man who could only propose to his sweetheart after proving he could defend her garden from thieves. Spoiler, he fails. Hilariously. And in 1978, an obscure BBC radio drama featured a fictional JP who refused to try cabbage cases out of protest, saying, "I'll not sniff another leaf to sort law from lettuce." So yes, the cabbage saga lingers less as a tragedy and more as a parody of human overreaction. A reminder that sometimes the world takes itself too seriously over things that grow quietly in the dirt. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes this bedtime history worth telling. You've wandered through hedgerows and village courts, stood beneath the cabbage gallows, leaf crown on head, sentence declared. And now you find yourself in a quiet garden, the fences mended, the soil tilled, and the world a little softer than before. Just one last thought. The next time you pass a cabbage in the grocery aisle round, humble, sitting with quiet dignity, give it a little nod. It's been through a lot. The garden is quiet now. You stand beneath a silvery moon in some dream version of Georgian England. Shoes a little muddy. A phantom cabbage tucked under your arm like a conspirator. Around you, hedgerows whisper, fences creak with imagined trespass, and the air smells faintly of peat, guilt, and a well-boiled dinner. But the final piece of this sleepy puzzle lies not in the fields or the courts, it lies in the mind. In how people remembered cabbage theft, retold it, and tucked it into the folds of British collective memory like an odd wrinkle in the national fabric. Because long after the vestries faded, the pillories were carted off, and the last wheelbarrow of shameful kale was dumped in front of an unsuspecting widow's door, the cabbage thief lingered as myth. The 19th century gave birth to a genre of literature and folk storytelling filled with romanticized criminals. The highwayman, the clever smuggler, the misunderstood poacher, and sliding into their ranks, not with pistols or poetry, but with dirt under his nails and a faint smell of vinegar, came the cabbage thief folk hero. Laugh if you must, but he existed. One such character, Old Mossy Jack, appears in Midland's oral traditions as a kind of Robin Hood of root vegetables. Supposedly, a war veteran turned wanderer, Jack would sneak into the gardens of the wealthiest manor houses, harvest precisely one cabbage, and leave a single silver coin in its place. Stories say he fed entire hamlets during the winter of 1812, whether Jack existed or not. He served a purpose, a leafy little revenge fantasy against the arbiters of harsh justice. A way to laugh back at a world that once fined people for stealing dinner. And Jack wasn't alone. Greensleeves Mary in Yorkshire Tales, said to wear a dress made of stitched cabbage leaves. living in the woods, punishing selfish farmers by stealing only their best vegetables and leaving notes like "share better." She was a kind of pagan cabbage ghost, and yes, people swore they saw her. Historians still argue whether these stories are allegories for changing class attitudes or simply the result of bored shepherds and too much cider. But either way, they grew from seeds planted by real laws, real hunger, and real people punished for needing something green to eat. By the 20th century, these tales slipped gently into satire. You see it in British comedy sketches, the fussy magistrate interrogating someone over unauthorized produce acquisition. Or the posh aristocrat panicking because the cabbages have gone rogue again. It became funny because it was once serious. Absurdity bred humor. In classrooms, it became a trivia nugget. Did you know people were actually punished for stealing cabbages? The teacher chuckles. A few students gasp. No one quite believes it was real. But it was. Every leaf, every logbook, every shame parade under a sky of English drizzle, it all happened. And in some odd twist of karma, cabbage itself got graded. By the 1980s and 1990s, artisan cabbage made its way into upscale markets. Savoy, Napa, purple heirlooms, all fetching prices that would make an 18th century thief faint. Once dismissed as peasant fare, cabbage was reborn as culinary gold. Irony served cold. Food writers began praising its texture, its resilience, its cultural legacy. Cookbooks leaned into nostalgia. Grandmother's braised cabbage, poor man's feast, greens of glory. You half expect to turn the page and see a recipe titled Penance Slaw. And so, the cabbage thief, once a villain, became a symbol. Not of crime, but of survival. Of the quiet desperation that shaped rural life. Of how hunger and punishment danced awkwardly around each other for centuries. Today, community fridges sit on corners in cities from London to Leeds full of shared produce. No questions asked. Urban farms open their gates to the public. Schools teach kids to grow kale in raised beds. No one gets pilloried. Well, not for vegetables, at least. So the story ends, not in shame, but in growth. In reclaimed dignity. In rows of thriving gardens, tended without fear, harvested without guilt. You take one last glance over your shoulder. The mist is curling low. Somewhere, a wind chime made from old spoons tinkles from a cottage window. Maybe it's a signal to the ghost of Mossy Jack. Or maybe it's just the breeze. Your arms are empty now. No stolen cabbage. No leafy collar of shame. Just the warmth of 1,000 sleepy stories folded into the soil. The punishment is gone. The cabbage remains. That's enough now. The world slows. The garden fades. The cobbled lanes soften into mist. And the moonlight slips behind a cloud like a gentle curtain drawing closed. You breathe out, long and slow, the scent of loam and old laughter clinging faintly to the edge of your imagination. There are no more fences to climb, no angry neighbors watching from shadowed windows, no creaky vestry benches or stern old magistrates waving soup-stained ledgers. Just the hush of the countryside, deep and timeless. Even the cabbages rest. Their broad leaves glisten under invisible stars, cradling dew, unmoved by centuries of theft, tales, and tribulations. They simply grow, steady, unfussed, quietly brilliant. Like the most persistent kind of hope. You sink a little deeper now, to the softness of your pillow, into the silence between words, into the spaces where stories become dreams, and dreams become rest. All those strange, leafy details, the punishment parades, the secret gardens, shameful collars of green, they slip away like footprints in damp earth, and what's left is peace. You did well to wander this far, to follow every winding path through a history both ridiculous and real, to laugh, to wonder, and now to rest. So let your breath settle, let your limbs loosen, let your thoughts drift like wind through treetops, because tonight you're safe. There are no thefts left to confess, no cabbages left to chase, just the quiet promise of sleep, and maybe, just maybe, dream where Mossy Jack leaves a silver coin by your door.